I was actually trying to troubleshoot an electrical outlet at my house yesterday, and I got the response in the AI overview and realized that what I was about to attempt to do was not a good thing. Real, legitimate marketing is so critically important in the higher education space right now. And that's just basic like SEO fundamentals, being able to obviously, both look for opportunities to exploit and then drive up rankings, which increases visibility.
Our guest today is Matt Herzberger, the Vice President of Digital Experience and Analytics at VisionPoint Marketing, one of the nation's leading higher ed marketing agencies. Matt has more than 2 decades of experience working with public and private institutions of higher ed and has expertise in digital strategy and planning, as well as e-marketing and management. Under his leadership, the VisionPoint team is constantly innovating and improving their services to ensure their web offerings are custom made for their higher ed clients' partners, needs, and goals. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot for having me, Steve.
It is my pleasure, my friend. I think we're going to have, let me check that. I know we're going to have a very interesting and fast-paced conversation about higher ed and SEO. So if you're ready, let's rock and roll.
Let's do it.
So I want to start high level, agnostic of industry, and talk about the 2 little, letter acronym that's in everybody's world, AI. And I want to start with, under the guise of SEO, but what is the current impact of AI on SEO, and where do you see the future when it comes to AI and SEO?
Yeah, definitely interesting question. And there's so many places to go. And of course, this could be a podcast unto itself. But it's funny. I spent so much time engaging in this. And I was actually at a conference last week where I got to see a lot of speakers on AI. And I always kind of, as much as I'm an optimist, I always have this initial pessimistic stance and like watching out for hype when it comes to new technologies that come into the space. So like I've embraced it. I use it in my daily work, use it in my service delivery, things like that. Definitely have been kind of an evangelist for people using it throughout our company. And admittedly, until I saw a particular presentation at this conference that I was at, I was of the like, oh, it's definitely coming. It's definitely something that I'm putting into my workflows. But I think I was like pushing back on the aggressiveness of the timeline. But then I saw a presentation this last week that like really just kind of like set me wild. And one of the recommendations was essentially to have a 2-year roadmap for where you need to be going with AI adoption, and then really digging in on specifically how quickly these models are going to be evolving. And it made me want to get considerably more aggressive and bullish than my already relatively bullish stance was. That said, I think like at this point, one of the things that I've been having a lot of conversations about is that I think today, if you want to look at it as like a AI maturity adoption cycle, most companies are pretty early in the upward progression of that. And one of the things that I've said is a lot of people, it feels like they're in the like having AI do parlor tricks. But like I want to get to AI becoming operationalized and really becoming a part of what we do. So one of the things that we're working on right now, for example, is being able to prime custom GPTs that are able to essentially get a lot of the priming from an industry and novice concepts out of the way so that we're able to like really build in mass. I think specifically in the SEO space, one of the places that we've seen the most adoption and most viability is specifically in building out blogs and articles, and those kind of like longer tail niche content is the place that we've experimented the most, and I think found the most efficiency and benefit as part of our daily workflows.
What impact has Google and Gemini had?
Yeah. So admittedly, in the higher education space, the amount of the AI overviews is actually extremely low. So in our industry in particular, it's not been a tremendous impact. But I think, as you kind of teed this up, looking at broader impact, I think, similar to any of the traditional like zero-click strategies, so to speak, that Google has, like they clearly want to like own and answer in the SERP versus trying to necessarily make you out there. For a lot of quick answery things, I was actually trying to troubleshoot an electrical outlet at my house yesterday, and I got the response in the AI overview and realized that what I was about to attempt to do was not a good thing. So it was very quick, actually, that I had that right there at my fingers. But I think it's definitely going to continue to have its impact. I still think that at the current state, a lot of it is what I would call those quick answer type opportunities, where I don't know that it's going to like usurp the deep dive and informational discovery, where typically when I'm spending my time in Google, I want to get a little bit more than just the quick thing that's at my fingers, unless, again, it's I'm about to do something stupid. Please save me.
It sounds like it did.
It really did. Yeah, I was probably going to cause some electrical problems at my house had I not caught that quickly.
Everybody get that? Lesson learned.
Yeah.
So let me just stay agnostic of higher education for 1 second. What advice would you give to anybody who's, in SEO or needs SEO or does something SEO when it comes to AI? How, and they're like, oh, well, I don't know what I should be doing, or what should I be looking at when it comes to AI and SEO? Are there just some tips or advice you would give to somebody when it comes to AI and SEO?
Yeah. So specifically, I think I try and stay out of the hype phase. And I think, honestly, it's continuing with the fundamentals. I think that obviously it's going to be a lot of kind of the longer tail in question-based queries. So from our keyword research standpoint, that's where we're starting to like segue a lot of our work. And we still are really leveraging, I would say, like our traditional keyword research on individual pages, but then we think in like on individual pages in ways where we can semantically mark up the page, or schema mark up the page to lean into those FAQ type opportunities. So it's like we're still doing what I would call a lot of the traditional stuff, but then leaning into the more conversational and stuff that you would have already been doing for voice search and Alexas and those types of things. But I think it's leaning in to that a little bit more than just the fully traditional stuff. But like, again, I avoid the hype. I still think the fundamentals are the fundamentals, but it's like you need to enhance on top of the fundamentals is the way that I've kind of interpreted it. And let's be honest, like this is all also so fluid that like there's not a 100% transparent crystal ball at this point that will explain where it goes. But I do think really a lot of these things Google has been signaling for so long that it's just an extension of what I would suggest is the pathway that they've been on for a while.
I really like your use of the word hype when it comes to AI. I could not agree more. There is an inordinate amount of hype around AI, but the challenge is knowing what's hype and what is reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's why I think as these practices evolved, it's like stick to the fundamentals and then incrementally grow into kind of the niche layers. So obviously I work in academia, and if you've ever seen kind of a chart that shows what a PhD is, it's like a sphere, and then you take out like a delta that is very extreme of deep knowledge for that, and trying to almost evolve the way that we're thinking about adoption of AI is like, again, it's still the common core of what is SEO, but then thinking about how you adjust your abilities to kind of evolve with other things. We've already had to do this with voice search. And again, it was leading towards query and question-based topics and queries.
Right. Okay. So you mentioned academia, and that's your bread and butter. So let's kind of shift into specifically that world.
Yeah.
And where should people focus, concentrate their SEO efforts when it comes to higher education?
Yeah. So the way that we kind of look at it is we take a hub and spoke or cluster. There's a lot of ways to say this in the SEO space. But we take this approach of foundationally focusing on product pages. So like in a corporate sense, this is like the most basic fundamental concept, but the idea that you have a product in higher education is still kind of a 4-letter word to some folks. So it's like to anybody who's in the SEO space, you're like, duh, like quite obvious. But in higher education, it's still ripe space with opportunity to exploit building product pages. And so like in higher education, we call them academic program pages, but essentially it's the page that grounds an individual offering of an institution. And again, if you were Amazon or selling widgets in a more B2B or B2C space, this concept is so novice, but it's still really, something to focus on. So we put a lot of our effort into academic program pages and being able to build, the best content that we can that tees up the offering. So just to make this real, if you have a master's in psychology degree at an institution, it's building a strong page that answers those key questions of prospects or buyers, so to speak, throughout their purchase journey. So, top of funnel content, middle of funnel content, obviously being able to hopefully convert them into a lead or applicant to use some of kind of the nomenclature of the higher ed space. And then a lot of it is also more what I would call niche supplementation or trying to own thematic topics through blogs and articles. So we kind of have this hub and spoke model where we look at individual program and or product pages as the core of that. And that's kind of the clincher page that we hope will convert someone into a lead. But then we also, I love fishing and I love using analogies. We cast a lot of other hooks out there, being able to build blogs that maybe go out a little bit more niche, a little bit more long tail, or you're digging deeper into, career opportunities, niche topics related to what that degree is, expected salaries, things like that. But again, you're trying to anchor back to that hub and being able to build that visibility for institutions. And obviously, higher education is an extremely competitive space. So if you can send up kind of that strong signal to Google, really own that footprint, that's really what we're trying to help you do, is own the footprint of that degree in a very competitive space in the higher education market.
It's interesting as you're talking, I kind of had this epiphany, if you will, and I'm thinking others may not have thought of it like this as well, that when you break it down to its most basic core, universities are their own brands. And if you look at it that way, and as a brand, and I'm a marketer and I've worked on 1,000 different brands, the same basic principles apply to any brand that would apply to a university.
Yep.
It's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's something that at traditional organizations, you have CMOs who, both market and sell, and it's kind of this cohesive dynamic between them. But in higher education, some of these concepts are challenging because in academia, the study of knowledge is the most important thing to them, not the commercialization of the study of knowledge. So these concepts are kind of challenging in the higher education space. But yeah, especially, some of these institutions are brands that have been around for hundreds of years and things like that. And so they've been shaped and cultivated and curated, but also one of the challenges in the higher education space is kind of operating in this sea of sameness, this concept that so many schools, especially, traditional liberal arts schools, their message is the same to everyone. You get to explore the humanities. We're doing it for low cost. We're accessible. We feel like a family. So many of these messages, you could swap the logo and apply them to any other school and they would more or less sound the same. So I think it's finding, as brand evolution happens in the higher education space, you really have to find those unique and core value propositions. And obviously, not that it's an explicit SEO practice, but obviously in marketing copywriting, you really need to understand the value proposition of the organization that you're marketing for and be able to speak to why you're more compelling to your competitor, aka the product down the street, is one of the things that I think there's so much more nuance. And obviously the pressures on the higher education are probably the most extreme they've ever been, all over the world, but specifically in the US, to where you're really needing to differentiate yourself to your audiences in your market space.
Yeah, it's like any other space. It's a crowded marketplace. And if you sound like the guy right next door down the street, you're not going to stand out.
Yep. Absolutely.
Is that,
Yeah,
is that
there's higher ed's been afforded this head in the sand mentality for a very long time. And unfortunately, that's coming home to roost right now. And so people are having to really figure out how to remain viable extremely quickly because of so many factors, primarily driven by what's called the enrollment cliff in the higher education space, which is the
Mhm.
decrease in college-bound students is tremendous. And then there's financial implications. State budgets are shrinking. There's just so many factors in the space. So like real legitimate marketing is so critically important in the higher education space right now.
How much was, I'm curious. I mean, obviously COVID affected the whole world.
Yeah.
But talk to us about the effect in higher ed, what happened during it and then what changes are still in place from it.
Yeah. So there's the amount of change that has happened, and it's hard to reflect on that as a broad thing or just marketing. The general shift is that essentially, whether you were ready for it or not, you had to be able to change modalities within weeks. And so by that, I mean, most universities are oriented around brick and mortar residential type operation. And in literally no time, schools had to pivot to be able to deliver online. Now, some schools had already been investing in that for years. So
Right.
they had a tremendous advantage in that pivot, and it was relatively easy. But there are still lots and lots of schools out there that are still not fully committed to the online and/or hybrid. And I would suggest that in and of itself is a pretty big challenge because obviously, you should be pivoting to consumer demand and the ways that they want to purchase your products. It's like, being deciding that you're a newspaper and the only way that you could deliver yourself is, well, either they're coming to get that piece of, that newspaper at your front door every day, or they're not going to hear from us. So that has been in and of itself a tremendous shift. COVID in and of itself, again, a lot of schools were hit tremendously hard during that. So there was government funding for a while that kind of carried them as organizations. And admittedly, a lot of that funding did prop up marketing because they had to, in a sense, market their way through the sales downturn that they had during COVID. There were a lot of funds invested during that time. And since then, those funds have dried up. So they're having to go back and be a little bit more resourceful on their own. So it's kind of an interesting impact. But yeah, I mean, it's like a paradigm shift in delivery model of higher education during COVID. So it was tremendously challenging for a lot of schools to pivot that quickly.
Yeah, I was curious to see, like we said, the whole world was affected, and higher ed is no different, right? So very interesting. You used the word hub earlier, and when you're using hub, the first thing I thought of was a website, right? Mm-hmm. Which, a lot of time in marketing, a layman or marketing vernacular, I should say, the hub is the company's website. And the question for you is, how can universities optimize their websites better to reach those prospects?
Yeah. So this has been really a trend that's been happening probably over the last, 5 to 7 years, is that traditionally higher ed websites were really used as kind of a megaphone to tout the outreach and PR things going on at the school. So, a professor gets an award, a big thing happened with sports, we got a big donation. And I'm talking about like homepages and the opening gate. But really, there's been a tremendous shift, and this is continuing ongoing, and there's need to go further into this, but a really big pivot to being focused on recruitment, which in higher education equals sales, kind of, or lead nurturing. But essentially, there's this real need to actually define who you are as an institution, to reduce friction to the buyer journey, to facilitate lead generation. And those are not activities that honestly were very common. If you go back like 7 or more years, they were really oriented in, again, that PR and outreach. But now there's this extreme need to pivot to really focus on selling the institution, to facilitating an easy decision/purchase cycle kind of through that user journey, and really building out the website well to be able to deliver on that as quickly as possible.
Interesting. keyword research is big for any industry, but again, staying in the higher ed space. So it's kind of a two-part. What's the significance of keyword research and how can institutions identify those high impact keywords?
Yeah. So again, a lot of it is grounded on the type of content that we're trying to build around, again, those academic program pages. I think also there's kind of this level setting opportunity. So, if you're in the higher education space, let's say you're working with like an MBA program, there's, I don't know, 2,000 MBA program opportunities out there in the United States. So like partially you want to lean into being able to win that in a more niche and nuanced way, be it your geo, be it the, special take that you've done on an MBA and things like that. I think specifically when it comes to keyword research, again, the fundamentals are the same as they are in any vertical, but I think you kind of really get this opportunity to focus, whether you're trying to do them at like informational, transactional types of keywords, and then being able to go a little bit deeper into specifically identifying keywords where you're trying to capitalize on buyer intent. And so like in the higher ed space, there's so much like signal to noise ratio. So like you go in and when we've worked with like new SEO vendors, there's a lot of like, wow, this term has, extremely high volume, extremely low competition. And then you look at there and it's like a professor who wrote something about birds. And we're like, cool, that doesn't have much like buyer intent behind that unless you can connect a really long trail of dots that's really not there. So you really do have to focus on like the right keywords that have some kind of either informational or buyer intent, because in a higher ed website, I mean, like the last institution I worked for was Purdue University. That domain was made up of easily millions of pages, but you have to look at the signal to noise in that and realize that like the signal is in those buyer opportunities. And that's where you really need to focus your effort, because I'm sure that there's some professor that's absolutely brilliant on some niche engineering topic, for example, but if there's no buyer intent behind it, you're kind of wasting your time on things that are not relevant to the buyer cycle.
How much, if any, did Google's decision to not eliminate third-party cookies affect higher ed?
I'll be honest, we spun our wheels and spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to tackle that. I mean, largely we are still leveraging first-party data, and this somewhat is related to our paid advertising operations that we do as an organization. But because of how large, complex, and decentralized web presences are for universities, it's very challenging. So like, unlike, you go to pick on a company like a TD Ameritrade, might have a large footprint, might have tens of thousands of pages, but those are traditionally owned by one central corporate marketing communications group. At a university of any size or stature, it's 100% decentralized. So like I've worked on many campuses where I was the central director of web, which from a corporate context might be like, cool, that means that you owned every page across that entire web presence. Again, just circling back to like Purdue, but I've also worked at other institutions, same idea. Well, that is so carved up based on the different institutes, colleges, schools. And there's this, obviously Google views the entire domain of purdue.edu as one thing, but the way that like institutionally that is carved up, it's a very decentralized model. So really what we're trying to do is be the best stewards we can of that entire domain, but understand that it's very decoupled and different people are kind of being brought to bear with different priorities to manage that. So it's kind of this, we're collaborative stewards, but in the higher education space, especially at schools of any size, there's not just one group that's managing it. Did that get to your question you were kind of alluding to?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, because everybody was on, I don't want to say pins and needles, but the whole marketing world was planning for the end of cookies, right? For years. Yeah. And then, they said it was going to be this year. Then they pushed it back. And then they finally just said, as you know, and everybody listening knows, they decided to not do away with them at all. So I was just curious, in the higher ed marketing space, what impact, if any, it had on that. So you answered the question. Thank you.
Yeah, no, and it was definitely one of these like scaling challenges. So again, the fact that like there wasn't necessarily one GTM to rule them all, like one container that, dealt with all those many properties, trying to figure out how to scale that was a tremendous challenge. And then also being a vendor partner of institutions who are typically working with some subset of, again, that maybe millions of pages, trying to figure out how to best help them kind of build the infrastructure to support those types of operations. Plenty in hours spinning our wheels was spent. But like we had started to figure out some traction in that, but it was definitely challenging to figure out how to do it in a particularly decentralized industry.
Yeah, you were hardly the only one in marketing.
Yeah,
with sleepless nights and planning for the cookie apocalypse, as I heard it called.
Yeah.
So then it turned out to be much ado about nothing. Looking at the time, I want to get in this last 2-part question.
Yeah.
How can universities measure the success of their SEO, and then what metrics should they prioritize?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I traditionally talk to people about measuring the impact of SEO in the higher education space, I talk about it on 3 levels. So there's what I would call a lot of the traditional ones, and I'm going to use softwares to kind of convey this as a concept, but there's like ranking factors. So again, that's just basic like SEO fundamentals, being able to obviously, both look for opportunities to exploit and then drive up rankings, which increases visibility. Then there's, your traditional things that you're getting out of Google Analytics, GA4, et cetera. So being able to look at page entrance, engagement, like those indicators that it's, for one, people have gotten there, but 2, they're engaging and hopefully digging into that content. And then 3, really the conversion data. And admittedly, that's the most challenging, I think, as a general concept, but also specifically in the higher education space, because there's not as many captive gateways to convert in higher education. So, in higher education, typically our top level conversion that we're looking at is creating a lead. And in higher education, they fill out what's called an RFI form, or request for info. But it's not typically as logical of a space in the user journey. So a lot of times it's like you're on a program page. Well, the RFI is over here in a completely other part of the property, but actually being able to measure and draw attribution from that organic lead, that an organic lead either directly or indirectly led to that conversion, is definitely something we need to do. And so again, to sum it up, I always talk about it as part of those 3 layers, some of them being more or less challenging to be able to set up the measurement, to be able to do those. But I think that that's kind of the ways that I would set up measurement and the ways that I would focus. But ultimately, as far as things to focus on, like the bottom line is what matters and what you can do to impact the business bottom line. So like those conversions are the things that I'm trying to drive the most. So we retooled our SEO service a couple of years ago, and admittedly, we got kind of distracted on rankings and things like that. And like ranking, again, it's there's a direct correlation to like better rankings equals more entrances, equals more leads, equals more sales. But in the end, we focus so much more on the final parts of that funnel, which is the sales or leads in our case. Admittedly, SEO directly doesn't typically influence the sale. Like it's not buying a candy bar, it's buying a product that costs $40,000 a year and you might move across the country. So traditionally, what we're, especially in the SEO space, is very focused on lead conversion. And then there's downstream nurture activities that'll happen most of the time. But to bring this home, what I'm trying to say is like all the traditional pure SEO measures and metrics are important, but if I had to focus someplace in particular, I'd focus more on those, on influencing those conversion metrics, because getting really high rankings but having no one convert is all for nothing. So it's all part of the formula, but I really focus on those, downstream conversions is kind of where we focus from a metric standpoint.
Gotcha. Well, listen, and I told you it would fly by, and it did.
It did.
Our guest today has been Matt Herzberger, the Vice President of Digital Experience and Analytics at VisionPoint Marketing. Matt, I cannot thank you enough for your time today.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Steve. Have a good one.
Hey, I'm the guy from the video you just saw. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. Now do yourself a favor. If you haven't already, subscribe to our content. Believe it or not, unconfirmed rumors and reports, you will see it increase in 20% in organic traffic just by subscribing. Okay, maybe not, but it's fun, right? But do yourself a favor, really. Subscribe to our content. You won't be sorry. Thanks.